Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the online conference M3, Man, Male, Masculine, organized by the Goethe-Instituts in India and Bangladesh. My name is Astrid Wege. I'm the director of the Goethe-Institut Max Müller-Baran in Calcutta. Together with our colleagues, we have organized the session with focus on masculinity and power. The connection between masculinity and power is a topic that is omnipresent in the discussion about different forms and ideas of masculinity, or what is a real man, what we already have seen in the film. When analyzing different constructions of masculinity, the focus is always also on looking at different structures of power oppressions that men exercise and to which they are also subject. Dealing with different forms of masculinity is a relatively new phenomenon. For a long time, masculinity has not been a subject of scientific research. It has been only since the 1980s that masculinity has developed into an independent field of research in more and more disciplines. The traditional invisibility of masculinity has long been a conscious or unconscious strategy for securing power. By refusing that the gender category also applies to men, they were also able to evade scrutiny as well as criticism and change. This conference aims to contribute to changing this. In our session, we will approach the complex question of the relation between masculinity and power from different angles. I'm pleased and honored to welcome today two distinguished speakers from Germany and India, Professor Michael Meuser and Professor Sumathi Ramaswamy. They will give keynote addresses of about 20 minutes each. After that, we will open the floor for questions. Our first speaker is Michael Meuser. Michael Meuser is a Professor Emeritus of the Technical University Dortmund. His research areas are the sociology of gender relations, the sociology of knowledge, the sociology of the body. He is currently co-leading a project funded by the German Research Foundation entitled Project Child: Parents' Constructions of the Gendered Child. The title of his talk today is Male Domination Under Pressure: Change and Persistence of Hegemonic Masculinity. Professor Meuser, thank you for joining us today. May I invite you now to take over? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. 30 years ago, French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu wrote that male dominance no longer asserts itself as a matter of course. It still exists, but is increasingly questioned and perceived as threatened. It is something, according to Bourdieu, that has to be defended or justified. In the following 20 minutes, I will explore the question: to what extent and in what way the ideal of hegemonic masculinity has lost its self-evident legitimacy on the one hand, but on the other hand continues to be present and effective as an orientation pattern, and in some cases is deliberately to be restored. Furthermore, I will pose the question whether new positions of masculinity are emerging alongside hegemonic masculinity. First, I will make some remarks on the concept of hegemonic masculinity. This concept was introduced by the Australian sociologist Raven Cornell in the 1980s, and it became the leading theoretical approach in masculinity studies, not only in sociology. Cornell defines hegemonic masculinity as a, I quote, configuration of gender practice which guarantees or is taken to guarantee the dominant position of men and the subordination of women. Hegemonic masculinity has a hetero as well as a homosocial dimension. That means it has a double logic of distinction and dominance. To quote Cornell, it is always constructed in relation to various subordinated masculinities as well as in relation to women. Male domination is not only exercised by men over women, but also among men. There are hierarchical relations among different patterns of masculinity, with hegemonic masculinity on the top. In modern industrial society, hegemonic masculinity is tightly related to occupational work and career, and therefore the figure of the male breadwinner is a core feature of hegemonic masculinity in industrial society. But do men still orient themselves at the pattern of hegemonic masculinity in current times? If we look at popular discourses on masculinity, we can get the impression that hegemonic masculinity is in a process of decline. The discourses are dominated by a crisis narrative, crisis of masculinity. Also, survey data suggests that hegemonic masculinity has lost at least its former normative power. Here we can see data published by the German Federal Statistical Office. The statement, "The husband's job is to earn money, the wife's to take care of the household and children," this statement reflects a core attitude within the frame of hegemonic masculinity. If we look at the data, we can see for 2018 that a majority of men, 66%, disagree with this hegemonial attitude. Only 14% support it. And the support decreased significantly over the course of 10 years, whereas the disagreement is growing. Nevertheless, despite this strong tendency towards egalitarian attitudes, the hegemonic construct of masculinity continues to exert a considerable normative force in everyday life. This creates tensions, ambivalences, and challenges for a growing number of men. Let me illustrate this point relating to data from two research projects conducted about 25 years apart. In both projects, we did group discussions with men, asking them what it means being a man. In the 1990s, the prevalent pattern was what we called habitual security. Habitual security, that means a state of unreflected being at home in the social world. To quote Berger and Kellner, they describe this state as follows: the basic conditions of the social world are taken for granted and usually remain so within the life course of the individual, at least of normal individuals. We found that for the majority of men in our sample, especially those with a secure employment status, their existence as a man was unquestionable in the 1990s. And they took the traditional male habitus for granted. When talking about the male breadwinner role, they typically concluded with statements like these: "This has probably been like this since ever and will not change," or "This is how it has always been, and why should I change it?" A self-evident reference to tradition is a central element of this habitual security within the frame of hegemonic masculinity. If we look at data collected 25 years later, between 2017 and 2019, the picture is rather different. On the one side, the traditional hegemonic concept of masculinity is still present as a positive orientation pattern for many men, especially for those in secure employment, but the reference to it is hardly made with the lack of questioning as in the discussions 25 years earlier. Further, demands for reflection on the male role are no longer perceived as an imposition. In a group of men who work in the insurance business, the position of the head of the family is inescapably given. To quote one group member, "Yes, as a man, of course, you have such issues like head of the family, the main breadwinner. Not the only breadwinner, but the main breadwinner." However, This statement is immediately questioned by another group member who said, well, I mean everything is certainly softening. I'd say the stereotypes of men and women, but I still feel personally pressed into a certain role, the breadwinner, the one who earns the money. These men rely on the traditional pattern of masculinity, but they are aware that the traditional role is in transition, that it is softening, as this man said. Further, the traditional ascriptions of position, especially of the breadwinner position, is perceived as burdensome. They locate themselves within the framework of the traditional hegemonic construct of masculinity, but this is accompanied by relativizations. The traditional construct becomes fragile. In a discussion with police officers, one group member said that it was important to him to, I quote him, to be able to give my future family security and that I can say, yes, okay, the money comes home. But immediately he adds that may sound like this classical role model, but that's not what it's happened. It's not what it's supposed to be. These men are aware of the recent gender discourse that criticizes the traditional attribution. Therefore, positioning oneself in the classic role model can only be made with reservations. The male self-positioning still takes place according to the traditional guidelines, but it lacks the taken for grantedness that was strongly present in the mid-90s. The pressure to justify oneself, as stated by Bourdieu, is clearly recognizable. In another group, the self-description as the breadwinner of the family is accompanied by the warning that can just come across super wrong. The traditional self-image is seen as something for which one has to apologize. Sorry, I have a rather conservative image as the provider of the family. The defense of the classical role image is done from a defensive position. This image has lost its self-evident legitimacy. Nevertheless, despite this loss of legitimacy, the classic role image remains present and effective as an orientation pattern. This is not only the case where, as in the cases reported previously, men refer positively to this image, but also in cases of explicit criticism and rejection of hegemonic masculinity. Those men explicitly complain about that the traditional pattern is ascribed to them and that they have to work at it. In doing this, however, they are caught up again and again by the rejected masculinity, as one group member explains with regard to his role as a father. I will quote him a little bit longer. Yes, that's what I mean, that things that you actually believed that you had a greater distance from, or that you had detached yourself from them, that in certain situations they come back to you and you realize, oh, I'm also entangled in these values and ideas that are so culturally anchored. You have a family and now you suddenly think you have to take care of it somehow, or you have to take an active role in securing the life situation or something. I already felt that with myself. The rejection pattern, in this case, the pattern of the male breadwinner, is hegemonic insofar that it is still present as an invocation that cannot simply be evaded. The will to stop practicing it fails again and again because of the social structures that are very strong still in present times. However, hegemonic masculinity is no longer the only expectation men are confronted with. It is increasingly accompanied by another expectation, which refers to the role of men within the family. Men should not limit themselves to earning the family income. They should participate in family work and especially in care work. This comes into play especially in the current discourse on fatherhood. And in this discourse, the figure of the involved father is a new ascription at men. Caring masculinity comes alongside the traditional hegemonic masculinity as a new expectation and identity model for men. Thus, hegemonic masculinity gets under pressure, but what the new idea of caring masculinity exactly means is still quite diffuse. And this creates a mixed situation, so to say, of old certainties and traditional power positions being threatened on the one side, and uncertainties about which gains the new options will bring along on the other side for the man. Within masculinity studies, the pressure on hegemonic masculinity leads to discussions whether new concepts of masculinity are necessary for describing and analyzing recent changes in the life of men and in images of masculinity. I will shortly rely on two of them, which are discussed most frequently. These are the concepts of inclusive masculinity and of caring masculinity. Inclusive masculinity, a term introduced by the American sociologist Eric Anderson, inclusive masculinity focuses on changing attitudes towards homosexuality. It focuses on a growing acceptance of homosexuality in many societies. According to Anderson and McCormack, a profound change in masculinities is taking place. I quote them: the stratifications of men become less hierarchical and more diverse forms of masculinity become more evenly esteemed. So-called non-conformist masculinities would be regulated to a lesser extent. According to this understanding, hegemonic masculinity is no longer the only legitimate form of masculinity. Anderson assumes a harmonious coexistence of multiple masculinities. In terms of modernization theory, one could speak of increasing options for men. The term caring masculinities was introduced by Carla Elliott, an Australian sociologist, into the theoretical discussion in masculinity studies. And this term, caring masculinities, is primarily related to the growing participation of men in childcare and family work. The term has also found its way into discussion within the European Union on the contribution men can make to realizing gender equality. Caring masculinity in this context is understood as a counterpart to hegemonic masculinity, based on men as involved fathers instead of breadwinners. According to Eliot, caring masculinity is characterized by a rejection of dominance and an incorporation of values of care into masculine identities. A so-called relational responsibility makes caring masculinity the antithesis of hegemonic masculinity. These two terms, inclusive and caring masculinity, refer to the fact that the spectrum of legitimate masculinities has expanded, and that, among other things, paternal responsibility for care or certain forms of homosexual masculinity have found their way into this spectrum of legitimate masculinities. The picture is more complex. We must also note that there are strong efforts to restore traditional hegemonic masculinity. In the case of the United States, Meuser Ferry diagnoses, I quote, a partisan conflict expressed in gender terms. And that means we have on the one side the supporters of achieving a fuller institutionalization of degendered partnership norms, and on the other side, the advocates of restoration of the masculinity-enhancing brotherhood states. And this latter policy relies on a victimization narrative for white masculinity and breadwinner family relations. A victimization narrative is also present in parts of the discourse of a crisis of masculinity. Donald Trump's displays of hypermasculine bravado, for example, can be understood as a part of the attempt to remasculinize society. In Europe, For example, there are, on the one side, tendencies towards a more inclusive masculinity, especially in some Western European states, but on the other side, the governments of many Eastern European states are working to restore traditional patriarchal family values and pursue policies of exclusion of LGBT people, as currently to be observed, for example, in Poland and Hungary. The United States, as well as Europe, show that changing masculinities towards more egalitarian patterns like inclusive or caring masculinity is always contested. From a sociological point of view, this is not surprising. This simultaneity of change and continuity is a basic characteristic of social development processes. This is an essential driving force of social change. The opposing tendencies in the field of masculinities and of gender relations generally are a typical constellation for modern societies. Social change does not automatically mean progress, and modernization of masculinity and gender relations is not to be understood as an unilinear development towards gender equality. The modernization of gender relations is characterized above all by contradictions, ruptures, and asynchronicities. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Meuser, for your lecture, which laid the ground for further reflections and discussions. I'm now very honored to welcome our second speaker, Professor Sumathi Ramaswamy. Professor Ramaswamy is James B. Duke Professor of History and International Comparative Studies, Chair of the Department of History at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, and President of the American Institute of Indian Studies. She has published extensively on language politics, gender studies, spatial studies and the history of cartography, visual studies and the modern history of art, and more recently, digital humanities and the history of philanthropy. She's a co-founder of Tasvirgar, a digital network of South Asian popular visual culture. Tasvirgar is partner of the M3 Man-Male Masculine project. On our project website, you can find German translations of some essays provided by Tasvirgar. The title of Professor Ramaswamy's lecture today is Man Behind Bars, Patriotic Masculinity in the Age of Colonial Incarceration. May I now invite Professor Ramaswamy to take over and give her lecture. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Vega and Professor Meuser, for your talk. I am delighted to join you all at this exciting event from my morning in Durham. From around the third decade of the 20th century, a new kind of man became visible in the highly crowded, patriotic visual landscape of modern India. This visibility emerged in the context of thousands of anti-colonial activists and nationalists being arrested and incarcerated in colonial prisons and jails. The experience of such incarceration, it was widely argued, made men out of boys and warriors out of men. As jail going became a desirable goal, indeed a coveted badge of honor for even the most respectable of and gentlemanly of men, hailing from the middle class and elite classes, as well as the upper castes of India, it also underwrote a defiant masculinity which came to be produced and performed behind bars. Such a masculinity explicitly turned around a set of professed political beliefs about empire and nation and newly forged ideals of citizenship and belonging. Correspondingly, as such beliefs were formulated and worked out behind bars, the colonial prison was turned from a site of horror and terror into a hallowed space, frequently likened to a mandir or a temple, an ashram or refuge in the writings of some ardent patriots. It held the key to the promised future of political freedom and independence, even though paradoxically, The jail was a quintessential statist institution, taking the form that it did as an autonomous space of incarceration, punishment, and reform in the colonial period from around the 1840s. Such a structure did not exist in the subcontinent prior to British rule. The jail as setting also became a systematic subject of artwork, also for the first time in the long history of visual practices in the subcontinent. It drew the attention of some of the best of artists precisely because it was perceived as the site for the performance of patriotic masculinity, of abject suffering being transformed into heroic sacrifice. In turn, the men behind bars are drawn and painted as defiant figures, boldly and unflinchingly looking back at the viewer, defying us to take pity or feel sorry for them. Instead, we are expected to experience a surge of pride, gratification, and wonder as we behold their bodies, constrained and confined, limbs shackled at times, even on the verge of being hung or executed in others. Through such artwork, men who are mere mortals are visually transformed into larger-than-life triumphal heroes who refuse to give in to the inevitable abjection and emasculation that incarceration meant under British rule in India. Sometimes stoic, at other times steely, and at still other times smiling, even in the face of inevitable death, these men show what it took to be real men, and consequently become exemplary for other boys and men to emulate and follow in their footsteps and into a life behind bars as a patriotic prisoner. In this presentation, I show some symptomatic images of this new kind of political man and the valorization of patriotic incarceration of such a man. Although my specific examples are drawn from early 20th century British India, I base my conceptual framework upon a growing number of recent studies that have focused upon what has been termed prison masculinities. Such studies have confirmed that in the contemporary world, as indeed historically and across cultures, the vast majority of prisoners have been typically male. As a recent anthology argues, albeit overwhelmingly based on American US evidence, quote, prison is an ultra-masculine world where nobody talks about masculinity. People who work with men in prison, religious leaders, educators, counselors, therapists, correction officers, and parole officers give far too little consideration to the ways that manhood and patterns of men's relationship with one another influence how men ended up in prison in the first place, how they function inside, and what happened to them if and when they are released and return to their communities. Excuse me. Even scholars who work in the burgeoning new field of men's studies have been curiously silent about men in prison. And when they do turn their attention to the incarcerated man qua man, as some recent studies do, they focus on masculinities that are inevitably deviant and criminalized, sexualized, brutalized, rendered toxic, stripped of dignity, stripped even paradoxically of manhood. I am interested in my ongoing project, however, in a very different kind of masculinity, forged out of the promise and plenitude of patriotic politics that is performed in prison, although the term political prisoner is itself a subject of some discussion and a category that was denied in British India despite numerous demands. A standard legal definition confers the category, quote, on individuals who have been sanctioned by legal systems and imprisoned by political regimes, not for their violation of codified laws, but for their thoughts and ideas that have fundamentally challenged existing power relations, end quote. And yet, as we will see, I am also interested in men whose very masculinity was redefined in the process of consciously and conscientiously violating codified laws, showing them up as fundamentally inequitable, unjust, and unethical, and being willing to invite punishment and imprisonment in the process of breaking such laws. This is a masculinity that emerges from the very practice of civil disobedience. It is a disobedient manhood rather than a manhood of conforming to a status quo deemed to be unjust and illegitimate, even unmanly. Such a paradigmatic disobedient manhood was performed in India over numerous decades by Mohandas K. Gandhi, British India's most famous political prisoner, although as some of the images I've already shown you indicate, he was by no means the only or even the earliest of men to be thrown into a colonial jail on account of his political beliefs or his anti-colonial actions. There is, for example, the Bengali teenager Khudiram Bose, barely 19 when he was hung by the colonial state in 1908, and whose death came to be visually celebrated in images even decades later, which show his youthful face wearing an impassive look as the British official counts down the minutes before the executioner's noose chokes him to death. And then there is the wildly popular Punjabi lion, Bhagat Singh, who too was hung to death in March 1931 when he was barely 24, and whose short but eventful time in a colonial jail, whose attempts to protest the indignities visited upon him and his fellow prisoners, and whose refusal to surrender his core political beliefs drew the attention of numerous artists, especially a painter called Roop Kishore Kapoor, who went on to produce many works on this heroic but murderous moment that were subsequently printed as posters and lithographs, many of which were proscribed by the colonial state and hence also readily available to later-day historians like me through the British Library's collection of such banned images, grainy and discolored though they may be by this time. The titles given to some of these prints themselves reveal the new kind of masculinity that is being produced, performed, and staked on the altar of freedom. Azadi ki Diwani, freedom's passionate men. India's lion in a cage. Temple of Freedom, Azad Mandir. In turn, these men were named as Shaheed, or martyrs, who willingly, even eagerly went to jail and died there, sacrificing their all for the sake of nation and freedom. But in the limited time today that I have today, I focus upon Gandhi, who of course famously and globally we think about as a saintly man of God, preaching and practicing his gospel of truth and nonviolence, quite different from the ideologies that suffused the violent sacrifice of Khudiram and Bhagat. This is a reminder that patriotic masculinity in British India took many shades and hues, encompassing those who took up the gun to bring down British rule, but also those who refused to do so, as famously exemplified by Gandhi. In the process of such a refusal, even while explicitly disobeying specific colonial laws deemed unjust, Gandhi ended up spending a total of 2,338 days in prison in colonial South Africa and in British India, give or take some 10 days over a period of about 36 years. From around January 1908, when he was first incarcerated in Johannesburg, as his life and career took a turn towards disobedience, Gandhi began going to prison as a high prestige activity for all self-respecting Indians, including increasingly and interestingly women, although they rarely, if ever, show up in the patriotic artwork as incarcerated prisoners. In the Gandhian world, jail going was nothing to be ashamed of. Indeed, the very opposite, as he called upon his compatriots to view prison as a palace. Over the years, he further elaborated on this theme, declaring in an article published in Young India in August 1921, quote, "If only our men and women welcome jails as health resorts, we will cease to worry about the dear ones put in jails, which our countrymen in South Africa used to nickname His Majesty's hotels," end quote. A few months later, he wrote in a similar vein on 26 January 1922, recalling his time in a South African prison, quote, "I learned most when I suffered most. It was the time of the fattest harvest. While the suffering lasted, it was difficult to bear, but it is now one of the richest treasures in life's memory. We have today converted the jails into heavens of refuge for liberty-loving men. They can be easily turned into abodes for attaining nirvana," end quote. So by 1930, he even came to compare his prison cell to a temple or mandir, a house of God where one seeks solace, sanctuary, and salvation. Of course, such a characterization came to be also possible because by this time, Gandhi might well have been not just colonial India's, but the British Empire's most precious political prisoner. Each time he was thrown into jail, often reluctantly and increasingly as a last resort, the colonial state worried about his health and well-being, especially as he had a tendency to go on grueling fasts while he was behind bars. So much so that in August 1942, the British jailed him in a palace, literally. As a political prisoner, he received kid glove treatment. Nevertheless, there were deprivations he suffered, including being cut off from family, friends, and the communities that sustained his political, ethical life. He was arbitrarily prohibited from writing letters to some people or receiving certain newspapers, which of course, for someone who was so media attuned, must have been a torture of its own kind. And of course, a life of constant mobility and travel was also brought to a complete halt. Nevertheless, being the man that he was, he also put the hundreds of days that he spent behind bars to constructive use, writing, reading, and spinning. The prison also was a site of Gandhian-style pedagogy, especially for the practice of sexual restraint, chastity, and celibacy. In the words of historian David Arnold, quote, "Prison impressed on Gandhi the need for the warrior fighting for nonviolence to possess physical strength and a capacity for endurance, as well as mental self-control. The satyagrahi, like the soldier, needed a well-disciplined body. A physical wreck would not be able to bear jail life," end quote. In the course of his numerous incarcerations, Gandhi thus fashioned for himself and for all his male followers a model of what I call disobedient masculinity, a masculinity that exhibited a productive dialectic between strict obedience and conscientious dissent. It was simultaneously moral, religious, and political, as befitted his philosophy of satyagraha, and necessitated the cultivation of a highly regimented body that could withstand manhandling by a wicked warden and also endure the multiple levels of suffering that imprisonment involved. At the same time, the satyagrahi prisoner had to conduct himself in a strictly correct, dignified, and submissive manner, obeying impeccably the rules of the prison, although within limits. Adherence to prison rules did not mean compliance with humility or debasement or giving in to indignities. As historian Ujjwal Kumar Singh has correctly noted, quote, "At the crux of Gandhi's prescription for prison conduct was an intricate view of satyagraha as a means for passage from subjecthood to citizenship. He saw prisons as the gateway to freedom under a tyrannical rule, end quote. Not surprisingly, jail going to Gandhi was an art, noting as he did in 1922, quote, "One needs to be an artist even to go to jail. Thieves and impostors go to jail, no doubt, but they do not secure freedom by doing so," end quote. The Gandhian man had to be an artist at heart, even while being a dissident satyagrahi in soul, spirit, and the body. Now, it has been frequently noted that some of the world's great works of literature and pieces of writing have been produced in jail by men. I'm thinking here of Martin Luther King's famous letter from a Birmingham jail written in 1963, and Nelson Mandela's life story, which was penned secretly by hand from around 1974 when he was imprisoned on Robben Island, and which was smuggled out in 1976 and eventually revised and published as the bestseller Long Walk to Freedom in 1994. Both men, of course, in various ways were influenced by and hugely admiring of the Mahatma. Gandhi too produced several works while he was incarcerated at various points of time, including a little noticed memoir titled My Early Life, whose production he supervised while he was in jail once again in March 1932. This book was a highly condensed narrative meant explicitly for boys in Indian schools that brought together his famous autobiography and another book he wrote in prison in the earlier decade, Satyagraha in South Africa. Short though My Early Life was, Gandhi thought it was important that his young male readers should know about his jail experiences in South Africa, which are described in great detail, almost as if he was preparing them for their own stint in prison, fighting for the national cause when they grew up to become men. In the Gandhian universe, the jail also thus served as a school for the nurturing and fostering of disobedient masculinity, which could stand up to the worst forms of terror and yet learn from them. As we know from his own candid confessions about his earliest experiences in a Johannesburg cell in 1908, not dissimilar actually to how Martin Luther King Jr. felt when he was first thrown into prison, Gandhi was terrified out of his wits, and yet from this cauldron of fright and terror emerged the Mahatma, the resolute satyagrahi, ever more convinced that it is only men with courage who cheerfully went to jail for their rights, even writing as he did, quote, "A time is coming when, to ascertain the number of titles a man holds, we shall have to inquire of him how often he went to jail," end quote. Today, the places where Gandhi was interred in India, Sabarmati Jail, Yeravda Jail, the Aga Khan Palace, and so on, are all major heritage sites on the Gandhi Memorial Tour. Professional artists have made the Mahatma's life in prison also as a subject of deep aesthetic contemplation. I close, however, with some images produced by child artists of Mumbai, who over the past many decades have routinely painted images of their Bapu, the beloved father, in the course of annual painting competitions conducted by the Mani Bhavan Gandhi Museum in Mumbai. In such works, we can see that the children see him as filled with power, even when incarcerated, as absorbed in favorite tasks such as spinning, writing, and reading, and meditating, and being the man that he fashioned himself to be, oblivious to the presence of guards or the walls that confined him and cut him off from the world. So indelibly have Gandhi and prison become associated even in the mind of the child that when young Sumathi was invited to paint on the topic of Gandhiji in my imagination, she placed him behind bars with a dove hovering over him, holding out the scales of justice. So to conclude, It is the privilege of the oppressed, Gandhi once wrote, to be in prison. Where tyranny rules, prison for a just man is a truly honorable place, end quote. A dominant theory of bourgeois masculinity posits that men become men by being in the world and in the public sphere, in contrast to women whose proper domain is the intimate and domestic sphere of the home. For a brief but consequential time in the early 20th century, an alternate model of manhood was offered to middle-class and upper-caste Indian men, one forged behind bars within the dark confines of a colonial prison. Set apart from both the home and the world, the colonial prison emerges as the proverbial third space in which men could be reborn as heroic patriots and celibate warriors, lions no less in some iterations. Their manhood dedicated not to material advancement or the reproduction of the self necessarily, but instead to a higher cause, that of freeing their nation from the tyranny of foreign rule. Not least, this is a manhood forged in relationship to other men, some of whom wielded cruel authority over them, but most of whom were like them, men who refound their motherhood behind bars. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ramaswamy, for your inspiring lecture with all these impressive images. So we just heard two very different perspectives, a sociological research, which also reflects a European Anglo-Saxon view by Professor Meuser, and an analysis of the construction of patriotic masculinity in colonial India by Professor Ramaswamy. I now invite the audience to ask questions to both Professor Meuser and Professor Ramaswamy. How do you see the modern patriotic masculinity? Can you give us some comments? It has evolved into a different concept, of course, defined remaining the same.
I would say so-called patriotic masculinity begins to take a dark form, especially, I would argue, with the rise of Hindu nationalism in a plural, secular India. A third part of this project focuses on a fantastic, disturbing image of Gandhi's assassin in prison. Mirroring actually these earlier images, of men who dedicated themselves to the cause of a secular Indian nation, plural nation, like Bhagat Singh. But Bhagat Singh is kicked out, and in his place, Goethe takes up the spot. As you know, Goethe too was executed, right? So in the next part of this, continuing part of this presentation, I explore, of course, with the rise of Hindu nationalism, patriotism itself comes to be redefined as dedication, not necessarily only to an Indian nation, but an Indian nation that is dominated by a majoritarian conception of Hindu nationalism. So that would be one very important direction I would take. But I would also love to be more global, if I can, of the opportunity as I continue this project by looking at moments like I've already invoked, like the civil rights movement in the US, and of course, the kind of fantastic anti-apartheid activism in South Africa, which also were nationalist causes. And then they produce a new kind of demand on the man to step up to the plate, so to speak, to demonstrate his adherence to causes of social justice. So there's also a global dimension to this project that I hope to continue, especially if I can find the kind of fantastic images that I find from India, which of course is such an iconophilic culture, right? So we have this wonderful production of visual culture, but I'm very hopeful, especially for the South African example. So thank you very much for that question.
How have other social institutions like religion been affected by the narrative of changing perception of masculinity? How much did Mill's work, Position of Women Determines the Progress of Civilization, affect or influence prison masculinity? Is it an extension of the Messiah mentality? ? Thus, challenging existing power relations create ways for prison masculinity to form new hegemonic structures. And is the celebration of confinement similar to the victimization as was evident in Professor Meuser's excerpts being glorified as survivor mentality?
I love this point about, is this an extension of Messiah mentality? There is, of course, an argument, I think, that you're suggesting that could be made about how these are saviors, right? They're trying to save, even while they are being incarcerated, they are being recast as saviors of the nation, as standing up to our freedom and so on. But in that process itself, they have been transformed into these savior figures, which I think is a very interesting way to consider what is going on, the transformations that are going on, in terms of the imprisoned self. Professor Moyes, how would you respond to that, I wonder, sociologically?
Yes, I would like to make a short remark on perhaps also on the first question. I think there's some relation between these two questions. The aspect of patriotic masculinity, I think, in a quite different way. Patriotic masculinity was a core element of hegemonic masculinity in European societies of the 19th century, where patriotism, nationalism, and masculinity was very close connected, at least at a symbolic level. And if we look at present efforts or present developments to restore male domination, especially among the political right, we also find a new connection of nationalism, patriotism, and masculinity. So I think this aspect of patriotic masculinity has different meanings in different social contexts and also in different historical epochs. And it is also interesting to see that at least in some societies in Eastern Europe, this patriotic masculinity is also connected with a strong strong efforts to restore traditional religious values. So there is a strong symbolic connection between these different aspects: patriotism, religion, and nationalism and masculinity.
How do you see political prisoners in present context? Women, Pinjara Todd activists being arrested. In Bhima Korkian case, we have Kabir Kala Manch, artist, man and women both going to prison. We have a woman professor, a woman lawyer too. How do you see masculinity in prison now?
Thank you, Kamayani. Wonderful. And because I'm a historian, at the moment I'm also very careful not to use specific moments in the past and universalize them. The current moment is quite different for many, many reasons, including the fact that, we now live ostensibly in a democratic India, so rights are worked out very differently in relationship to the Indian state, as opposed to the context which I described in the short talk, which was in an authoritarian colonial context. And yet, I am also very interested in the question of the female prisoner. There was, from the early years of the 20th century, women too who were joining up to the national cause, including Gandhi's wife, Kasturba, went to prison, as did many other Gandhian women. But at least as of now, if anybody in the audience, of course, knows better, please write to me. I have not been able to find women images of women being thrown into prison. They never show up in this kind of patriotic pictorial landscape, which then, going back to an earlier question and a point, so this kind of patriotic visual material is reconfirming, if you will, a certain kind of, if I can borrow from Professor Meuser, hegemonic masculinity, right? If only men are shown, patriotic men are shown as being behind bars, as being heroic, sacrificing, and saviors of the nation, What about women who went to prison? So I'm very interested in questions of visualization, visibility and power. And given the manner in which these kinds of images saturate the visual landscape of India, I'm interested in how they may in turn reaffirm a certain kind of dominance of the male body, right? Which is, of course, in contrast to the highly sexualized female bodies, which are also very visible in the visual landscape of India, right? And I would love to bring this project all the way down to today, especially the last especially the last few years of enormous righteous dissent in India, in which women have taken the lead. As you note yourself, the Pinjra Tod women, fascinating women, right? I would love to bring it down, but I am not yet there at that stage. I'm still working through the material in British India, though I have the present always in mind when I think through the questions of the past.
Is it possible that the idea of any masculinity being a hegemonic form of masculinity will be wiped out?
I think we must see that hegemonic masculinity is not something that is fixed forever. What hegemonic masculinity is always and was always contested, and it changes itself in confrontation with other forms of masculinity. For example, a key point in the discussion on theoretical concepts in masculinity studies is, for example, is caring masculinity a counterpart to hegemonic masculinity, or is it possible that further development of hegemonic masculinity will integrate at least some aspects of caring masculinity? And I think we can observe this in newer developments of caring fathers who try to combine, to integrate caring aspects in a traditional pattern of male existence. Yeah? Also to be the provider, or at least the main provider for the family, and also be more in contact with their children than their fathers were. So I would think that the fact that new patterns of masculinity emerge do not automatically have the effect that hegemonic masculinity is in a decline. And I think we have hegemonic masculinity itself is changing in confrontation with other forms of masculinity.
Thank you, Professor Moyes. I think you said it very well. As a historian, I am not as optimistic, I would say, because there are various ways in which, even as advances are made, even as men want to be more caring, as you put it, other forces converge upon them, sometimes even from women, actually, I would say. It's not only, society, but often expectations of women that may push them into hegemonic masculinity. But I want to say, as an ethical human being, I hope for the best. I hope, in fact, that there will be a time when we have no hegemonies of any kind, even, masculinity. So it would be a divided answer. The historian in me is a little skeptical, I have to say.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Meuser. Thank you, Professor Ramaswamy, for joining us today, for sharing your thoughts and insights, and also answer the questions from the audience. Thank you all for attending this session. Next up, we take a short networking break. The link you can find in the chat, how to attend the networking session. At 6:30 p.m., a very exciting performance will follow, Becoming a Problem, a text concert by Susanne Sachse. Don't miss it. You also find the link in of the performance in the chat. Again, thank you all for joining this session, and see you soon, hopefully in other sessions. Goodbye.
Goodbye, and thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.